Hello, Garland Nixon. We're hanging out with the one and only Peter Erickson. Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Peter Erickson, and you can find Peter on his great stream, which is called Conversations Among the Ruins with his son Charlie. One of my favorites. I've been watching it. I think when I first started watching it, it had like 8,000 followers or something. How many? Where are you guys up to about 40, 50,000 now, aren't you?
Yeah, last I checked, it was 41,000.
41,000. You're rolling, and you should be because it's a great stream. I think people enjoy it. This is what YouTube is about. God knows we got enough AI slop. Oh my God!
Yeah, no, he's really my son. He's not my AI son.
He's not an AI son, right there. Oh my God! At any rate, so let's get rolling. We're going to talk about certainly the backlash about Israel, but I wanted to ask you something before we get going with that. Sure. Let's hit something that I just want to get some other people commenting on. You know, soybeans of all things. China buys 61% of all soybeans in the world, which, if you know anything about, the eating habits, certainly made, and having 1.5 billion people makes sense.
Right.
And the United States lost that entire market over tariffs, over our tariff war on China. And China says, I think I'll buy soybeans from somebody else, namely a BRICS country, Brazil, and other places they can get their soybeans. Okay. We got these soybean farmers screaming because I saw one thing that they were selling like 26 billion pounds every 4 months or so, an unbelievable amount, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And now they're saying they may need a bailout. Here's the problem. The market's gone. A bailout ain't going to do you no good.
Right.
Hey, we need a bailout this year. Okay, but don't bother planting your crops next year. You no longer have a market for crops. This is not a bailout situation. This is the end of your market, and it's not coming back.
Yeah.
This means that John Deere, if you've got this giant market selling untold tens of billions of pounds of soybeans, you're selling a lot of combines and John Deere equipment. That's all going to have to be repossessed. And what good is it going to do you to repossess? You're not going to get paid for it, and you can't auction it off because nobody needs it. Mm-hmm. This is the one hell of a mess.
Oh, yeah.
That Americans talk about a lot of the issues we're having. Oh, it's stupid to do tariffs and this and that. This is a reality about some of the horrible things that farmers are going to be facing and other people who provide things and services to China or India or these other countries that are going to say, you know what, the U.S., you guys are not a reasonable partner. I don't want it anymore.
Right. No, yeah, it's a huge mess. And I think particularly for Trump and his administration, because farmers by and large are Republicans. That's been true for a long time. And I think it's incredible that actually they didn't think through this and, think about the consequences for American farmers. It's going to hurt them. I mean, it is hurting them now, but I can imagine like when the midterm elections come along, the thing is probably the Democrats will find some way of shooting themselves in the foot and, won't take advantage of it. So it's just like the opposition is so pathetic. The Republicans might just get away with it, but it is a really, serious own goal. This has done real economic and therefore political damage.
Here's an example. Let me find it. Okay. Here's a perfect example of what we're looking at here. Okay. Chuck Grassley from Iowa. Iowa farmers need China back in the soybean market, Naig and Grassley say. Iowa Republicans are urging a trade deal with China to resume U.S. soybean purchases, right? And there they go. We got to talk to China. We got to get this market back, right? Well, you know what? these same guys were like, the Chinese Communist Party is terrible. We've got to send more stuff to Taiwan to threaten China. We've got to send weapons to Philippines, and we got to prepare for war with China so we can destroy. Why they're trying to stop us from being hegemonic, and they're doing things in the South China Sea that we have not approved of. We got to deal with China. This was like, now it's, holy crap, we lost China, and the people in my state are screwed. If I was, here's what I said a few months back. I said, if I was China, I'd say, you're building missiles to attack me with. Anything that you use to build those missiles ain't selling. Oh, by the way, you're using your economy to buy stuff to build missiles to attack me with. So if I can wipe out your economy, I got to do it. I not want to do it, even if it hurts me economically. If you say to me, hey, Garland, Peter here. What's happening, Peter? Hey, I wanted to buy a gun to shoot you. Can you give me a ride to the store? No. All right. Can I borrow a few bucks? I'd like to get it. No. No. What are you doing? I'm going to buy a gun to shoot you with. Perhaps I could not go along with this plan.
Garland, you're being very unreasonable.
You're right. Not selfish of you. You get my point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, what I heard is that what the Chinese did specifically was to greatly restrict, if not actually end, one particular rare earth called germanium, if I remember correctly. And that's particularly important for military technology, for those missiles that you were talking about.
For sights.
Yeah.
They use it for sights and targeting and stuff like that.
Okay, right.
But the missiles have sighting.
Yeah. No, so it's essential, right. So, why are you surprised? I think it's just amazing that they've been drawing up these plans to attack China, for years, if not decades, and that nobody stopped and thought about, well, wait a second, where do we get all our military technology? Where are these components and these materials coming from? I just think it's just beyond, stupid. What else can I say? But it seems to be dawning on people now, and they're panicking, but it's a little bit late. Maybe those farmers might get lucky. It's just like, who knows, that the Chinese knew where the pressure points were. They knew that farmers were important to the Republicans. Okay, let's squeeze them a bit, and then we'll see what we can get. Maybe we'll just agree to start buying some of those soybeans again, but you're going to have to cave in on some other things. It's not going to be, there's going to be a price to pay.
Here's a perfect example. Okay, here we go. Mr. Big Talk. Chuck Grassley says he would reverse China's favorable trade status with the United States, right? If you're a Republican, it's so popular to say mean things. Well, if it were me, I wouldn't do this to China. I'd fix them. We've got to put Typhoon missile launchers in the Philippines because China, why are we doing this with China? Okay, China ain't buying soybeans from you anymore. Oh my God, somebody quick call China.
Right. Well, I think what it shows is just how shallow all of this is. This is not an existential, conflict for us. China is on the other side of the ocean, a good 5,000 miles away. We're talking about, issues that have to do with the South China Sea. We're not talking about the Caribbean. So, when push comes to shove, and I think the Chinese understand it, it's really, to the average American, this is not that important. The more important thing is that, I have a steady income. I get have a market for my soybeans, or whatever it might be. Or if I go to Walmart, those cheap goods that I'm used to getting, they're still on the shelves. That's what they really care about, and they kind of enjoy, I guess, a lot of them without thinking about it. All that tough guy rhetoric about China, the occasional chest pounding and whatever. Say, yeah, Senator Grassley, you tell them. But they're not thinking it through. And when it comes to when the consequences appear in the real world, hey, we were just having some fun there. We were just kind of, we weren't serious about that. I got to sell those soybeans, man.
Kind of like I used to like Maxwell Smart on Get Smart, and there'd be some chaos agent, this big guy, and Max would say, "I'm not scared of this big stupid gorilla," and he karate chop the guy, whap, and the guy would move. And then he'd punch him, pow, the guy would move. He'd kick him, wham, the guy would move. And he'd look at him and he'd lean over to the guy and go, yeah, I hope I wasn't out of line with that crack about the big dumb gorilla, right? And the guy would beat him to a pulp, right? And that's what we got here. Again, now watch this. Let me show you the way it works. GOP senator applies for farm aid, but maintains support for Trump's trade war with China. Senator Chuck Grassley owns a farm in his home state of Iowa, and like many farmers, plans to apply for tariff relief. Well, if you and I ask for it, they say welfare. Yeah, come on. This is socialism. Garland Nixon asking for a couple dollars for food stamps or something. Screw him, you lazy bastard. Meanwhile, you are a U.S. senator who owns farms in Iowa. And it was, China, there's nothing but trouble here. But I think you could help spare a few dollars for a fellow American who's down on his luck.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the whole thing's pretty funny. I actually, if I was living in one of those rural counties there, I would be pretty upset. I could see the consequences. But watching it from a distance, forgive me, it's actually kind of comical.
It really is. It's unbelievable to watch this thing unfold. And it comes down to this. A certain element in a faction, dare I say, in our the main faction, the principal faction in our foreign policy establishment, can't seem to grasp the reality of the unipolar world. They still think they can boss people around, and it's like, you better do what I say. And then every now and then reality smacks them in the head, but they're like, you better do this. And other countries are like, oh no, Russia, you better do what we say. We'll do whatever we want in Ukraine. And Russia's like, no, you won't. Yeah, we will. Russia's like, okay, well, we'll just physically kick you out of Ukraine. You can't do that. Watch us. And now China, you better do what we say or else. And China's like, we're not really listening to you. You better. And it's always the same thing. Okay, well, there's a kinetic reality. And let's see how this kinetic reality works. Yeah. And we don't have the economic or military power. And we got a bunch of people that don't realize that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the source of all this comedy or tragedy, depending on how you look at it, is really the disconnect between the assumption of hegemony, this idea that we are still the hegemons, that we are the hyperpower, and the new multipolar reality. The world has changed. We're living in a very different world than what we lived in, let's say, 25 years ago. And again, this is where we're getting the comedy, all these wild statements that are just so, ridiculously divorced from reality, because they're still inhabiting that world of about a generation ago. And I think it just felt so good. It just developed this habit of being the the bully in the schoolyard, that it's just not something that they can easily let go of. This became something of great importance to them. This identity as the world hegemon, and it suffuses everything in the administration and every action and all the rhetoric. But we are seeing, especially in these last few years, especially since the launch of the SMO, we're seeing that pretended hegemonic the position that we have coming into conflict with the reality, in big ways. There's certain moments, I think, particularly like, the ruble's going to be rubble, the economic sanctions that were just going to cause the total collapse of Russia. Everybody's waiting for it to happen. Yeah, it didn't. We don't have to get into the detail, but it didn't, not even close, quite the opposite. I think another moment, of course, was I think the bone crushing sanctions. And, you say Trump was working himself up. Yeah, he was going to slap 100% sanctions on China and on India. And in the end, we got 25% 25% tariffs on India as a punishment for, buying Russian oil. But even that had a whole bunch of exemptions carved out of it. It's not even what it looks like. And it just like, in the end, he came up to the wall, and there was enough, appreciation of the reality that he said, let's do something else. And we had the Alaska summit and then a whole bunch of other nonsense after that. But they still can't stop talking. Like, nobody wants to be the politician that says, okay, guys, it's over. We're no longer number one on the block. We're going to have to retreat and just kind of accept that we're just one among equals. That's That's just again because I think the American population has been fed on this for such a long time. It's like waving the big number one finger at a football game, and you're telling me I can't wave that finger anymore? Hey, guys, they don't want to hear it, but at the edges, you see it's happening. They're just kind of bumping into this reality, and the soybean example is another good example of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And when you look at it, I think another, believe it or not, I think we've just seen another seminal moment, shall we say, another very, very, very important time. And that was Trump saying to the Europeans, they're always screaming for more sanctions on Russia. And in a way, in his own way, I don't know if it was intentional or not, Trump really kind of called their bluff. Whether it was intentional or not, what that was about, it could have been him knowing Trump, trying to duck out of being cornered again. Like I say, you can never corner Trump because he's always going to squirm out of the corner. But when Trump said, all right, tell you what I'll do. You guys want these massive sanctions, don't you? Yeah. Lindsey Graham, all you guys, you want bone-crushing sanctions. So everybody wants bone-crushing sanctions? Yeah, fair enough. You're going to have to bone-crush them. And every one of you, Turkey, every one of you are going to have to do the bone-crushing of all bone. You want us to get completely cut off Russia. I'm ready to do it. But you're going to have to do it first. And as soon as they say we can't afford to do it, you're exposed. As soon as they said, oh, well, we can't afford to go that far, you've been exposed.
Yeah, no. Well, I agree with you. I'm not sure. A lot of people are assuming that this is, a very, very clever, bluff on the part of Trump. I'm not sure about it. It's possible. I admit it's possible, but I think it's actually more than anything, it's just an indication of the U.S.'s weak position. That look, why didn't you do it earlier? You attempted this, this trade war with China, and you had to end it because the alarm bells were starting to ring all across the country. It's like, hey, the shelves are going to be empty soon. Hey, we can't make any more of those, those missiles that we love so much. And so yeah, he kind of understood. Just forced, backed off, and then. But anyway, yeah, you can't quite admit that what's happening. He's like you say, he squirmed out of it. He squirmed out of it once by going to the Alaska summit. I think that was the way. And then there's this continual pressure, and he's just saying, "Man, I can't do this." If he really could, if America was that strong, if it was the America 25 years ago, sure, yeah, just slap them on, and they'll just, they'll come to the negotiating table, begging for relief of some kind. But those days are over. That was 25 years ago. It doesn't work. And on one level, Trump understands that and just knows it's not going to work. And so he said, well, he just figures, well, maybe if we get everybody to do it together, like, it's just like, I try to pick on the guy, corner him in the schoolyard, and, I couldn't scare him. In fact, when I threatened to punch, he punched me in the gut, and it really hurt. So, but if I get all these other guys, all these little guys, we all come in a big crowd, then we corner him, maybe he'll give up. I kind of think that was really the logic behind it.
It's possible. I lean more towards this, that it wasn't as much of a strategy about either the EU or about Russia. It was about Trump saying, man, I don't want to do this crap. And if I do this, it's going to wipe out my economy, and everybody's going to blame me, not you, Lindsey Graham, or not none of you, not any of you guys that want me to do it, or not the EU. If I do this, my economy will get crapped out and I'll pay the price, right? I think my opinion is Trump is like, how can I squirm out of this? They're pressuring me. I know. Here's how I'll get out of it. I know they can't take this. I'll say, if you do it, I do it, knowing that they can't. And when they say they can't, then I can say, oh, well, I can't either. So I think it was more about, my opinion, it was a door that Trump was before himself to get the hell out. But it doesn't matter.
Right.
His motivation is irrelevant. The truth of the matter is this: it exposes something. It is a moment when something is exposed. Right. For all the talk they have, the Europeans are still getting a lot of stuff from Russia, and they can't even afford to stop. So how can you expect China or how did you ever expect that you were going to go to all these countries around the world and tell them to stop buying Russian stuff when you can't even do it, and you supposedly hate Russia's guts?
Yeah. The whole thing was absurd to begin with. They're talking about China and India, but if you look at the buyers, okay, those are the two main buyers, true. But I think number 3 is Turkey. a NATO member. And then number
Right.
four, I believe number four is the EU. They were still buying it. And then if you look at it really honestly, it could have been even more than that, because so much of that oil that the EU has been buying is actually, so-called Indian oil, is in fact Russian oil. So you can imagine, like with the Indians, you say, what are you doing? I see you guys are buying it, and now I've got to pay these tariffs. This whole thing is so absurd. What were they thinking? And none of it really added up.
Yeah. So let's go on to another part of the U.S. imperial collapse, shall we say. Israel is the state religion of the ruling elite. The ruling elite, they're all, you got to support Israel no matter what. We saw something in Hollywood, of all places, where like 1,500 actors and actresses signed on to some document saying we're not going to work with Israeli film industry. It's up to 4,800 now, right? Which is unthinkable in Hollywood. We're seeing a lot of indicators. And of course, with what happened to Charlie Kirk, what's interesting is immediately all you saw on the line was Israel did it, right? Notwithstanding that discussion of all of the evidence,
right.
For, against, circumstantial evidence, all that kind of stuff. We've all had that had that discussion, and we know the direction that it leads if you follow it enough. I'll put it like this. You can certainly come up with a motive. You know what I mean? You can certainly say this group wanted this guy dead, or at least out of their way. Okay, that doesn't mean they did it, but it does mean they wanted him out of the way. And now that he's out of the way, they got their guy in his position. All looks quite suspicious. But what's interesting is this unmanageable backlash that is growing, and it is growing, getting faster and faster, and it is starting to infect areas of our society that traditionally Zionism could do no wrong. Your thoughts on this and where it's going?
Yeah, well, it's huge. Of course, it's something that certainly predates the Charlie Kirk assassination, even predates October 7th. There has been a trend away from Israel. That's what the polls have been showing. But it really accelerated after October 7th. And then, I think what we're seeing with Charlie Kirk is how much American culture has changed just in these last couple of years. That again, there was opposition to Israel, but it was certainly a minority voice. And on the Republican side, it was very much a minority voice. But that's no longer true. That has changed. We live in a different world. And, that's what the polls are telling us. There's dramatic shifts. So, like what we have, like you mentioned, there's clearly a motive in this case for Israel. He was questioning, I've seen the clips. He began to question, Israel and the whole Zionist project. Maybe it wasn't going to go that far. He was still a Zionist, but there were some, for the Israelis and Zionists in general, there was some alarming changes, or indications of possible change, of a new, of him actually, rejecting let's say, if you're a Zionist and you say, if Charlie Kirk actually goes against us, this could be fatal, because this is the guy, that the younger generation of conservatives really look up to. And they're the only ones that we really have left within the younger generation. And if he goes against us, we're just cooked. So yeah, they had a motive. There's no question about it. They had a very powerful motive. And then you have to say, everybody's looking at them. They've been on this assassination spree. Of course, it goes back actually decades, all the way to, even before the founding of Israel. But especially in the last couple of years, the last year or so, it's just been, it seems like just every other day there's a decapitation strike or an assassination. Clearly, this is something that they do, and they do quite regularly, and with any regard, it seems, for their for the United States, its interests, and for their reputation. It's just like they're beyond that. They're out of control. So people see that. They've started to notice that. They are aware of the motive, and so they wonder. I'm not going to say whether or not they did it. I really don't know.
Right.
But I have my doubts about that. But I think it's very reasonable to ask that question, and I think it's actually a healthy phenomenon as far as it goes, that people are asking that question. Whereas in the past they would not have. It shows that we are, America is in a different place now, and it's got to be a scary place for Israel supporters.
I think another thing that's happened is this: over the course of years, there was the JFK assassination, and there's been much investigations into that. And people have said, well, it kind of looks like something's awful crappy there because the U.S. And here's the thing: the U.S. government still has a bunch of documents that the law says they must release, but they won't release. Right? We've got so much to look at that. Everybody's like, well, clearly somebody was up to no good there. It's pretty clear now. But people look at 9/11 and they're like, the more evidence that comes out to that, the more there's, what's up with the infamous dancing Israelis. Everybody, knows about that. You can literally go online and read the FBI report on the dancing Israelis, right? There's so many things that we look at. And now people are starting to, there was a time when people called you a conspiracy theorist. Oh, that's just a crazy conspiracy theorist. And now people are like, the difference between the truth and a conspiracy theory is about 6 months.
Yeah, right.
Actually, it's getting to that point where people now say, the powers that be have very complex ways of accomplishing their diabolical goals. So even if this kid comes out and says, I did it no matter what, there are people that are going to say, yeah, it looks that way. But we've seen things in the past where it seemed pretty clear. And upon closer investigation, it wasn't as clear as it was in the past. And so it's not a hard leap from somebody to go from, it appears that we have a pretty solid suspect to, yeah, we've seen solid suspects in the past that weren't as solid as we thought they were.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think what we have is a huge crisis of legitimacy, especially in connection, when matters concern Israel. We've just seen it happen again and again. You mentioned the dancing Israelis. They held those guys for 2 months and then they just shipped them back to Israel. And we never found out, okay, well, what happened? Why weren't they arrested, brought to trial here? What's going on? Or there was that whole very strange the Israeli art students caper that preceded, again, 9/11. Something huge was going on, but it was never, and there were alarm bells, rung in the different federal agencies, but we never had the investigation. And this is something that we've seen happen again and again. I think the most egregious example is probably the USS Liberty. But it's so, there's this sense that if it has something to do with Israel, we'll never get the investigation. The authorities will never,
what was the girl's name that they ran over with the bulldozer?
Oh, yeah.
Rachel.
Corey.
Yeah, they ran over an American. Then recently they killed a bunch of settlers, like beat an American citizen to death. The government didn't do anything. Yeah. We had the guy in Ukraine. I forgot his name. I actually went on his show when he was doing this show.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and right. Yeah, I went on his show and got interviewed by him.
Right.
And this guy, when the Nazis could, and everybody was online everywhere saying, hey, the U.S. government has to do something. And we found out later on the State Department knew about it and really didn't do a darn thing and just let him, kill him. So people are looking at it saying, not only will these proxies do very evil and devious things up to and including murder to American citizens, we now clearly have the Merit Vets list, which apparently is out of Virginia. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know it was out of Virginia. I thought I knew it was funded.
Look at the metadata. It's like it's from Virginia, the home of the CIA. So the bottom line is, Americans now look at it and say, overseas proxies can kill Americans, and the government won't do anything about it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, we've seen it. So, maybe like in this case, maybe they got the right guy. He has nothing to do with Israel. But if a lot of us are asking questions, a lot of people don't believe it. If there are a lot of so-called conspiracy theories, who do you have to blame? You got to blame the government itself. It has this very bad track record, and And what you do, you invite a lot of skepticism. It used to be maybe a couple of generations ago. I think, yeah, it was true a couple of generations ago. People by and large trusted the government, the FBI, and everything to do their job. I think that trust was often misplaced, but it was there. And now, again, this is not, my own wild theory. This is what the polls show. All these institutions, the U.S. government, the FBI in particular, all of them have really lost the credibility that they once had. Once we trusted in them. The people did, and that is largely gone. And so we do have now the internet with everything buzzing and everybody throwing out different kinds of theories, and it shows again. Yeah, I think all in all, it's a healthier situation, but it contains its own dangers too.
Yeah, you look at recently, they've done decapitation strike. It's attempted them in Iran, attempted them in Yemen, attempted them all everywhere in the world. A guy who I interviewed before, Chris Smalls, I saw him. He was on one of these boats, and they go to Israel, and they drag everybody off the boat. He's the only black guy on the boat. They beat the crap out of him, and then shove everybody into a jail for a couple of days, and then send them home. I mean, anything they could do to look bad and make themselves look like absolutely evil fiends,
Right.
they've done. And at some point, you have to realize that when you have this much hubris, when you're just like, we can do anything we want and nobody can stop us, that at some point people are going to say, we notice a pattern here and we're not going to support you anymore. And the best they can do now is to say, well, I guess that means we got to crack down on people who are complaining.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what's happening. It's a consequence of decades and decades of unconditional support for Israel. That the Israelis have learned over time. I think, initially they couldn't quite believe that they could get away with murder, but over time they learned, oh yeah, we can do anything. And so now, yeah, they behave with, they assume that they're not going to suffer the consequences. They can behave with impunity, and so far that's true. But I think that their days. The problem, of course, with that kind of behavior is that, okay, you still have your backers in the U.S. government and in some of the leading Western governments, but the rest of the world is seeing this, including the people of these countries that you depend on so much. And again, the mask is off. The veil has been torn. They've seen through it. And yeah, you can, again, because there's just this institutional inertia and there's those people in power, they're not going to be thrown out of power immediately. You can continue to get away with it for a while, but your days are numbered because people see it. And there will be a changing of the guard, a revolution, something in these countries. And when that happens, Israel is going to be truly the pariah state. It's not going to have the U.S. backer that it's been depending on. And then, we'll see what happens.
Well, here's the other thing too, and that is, there's an old saying, the same thing will make you laugh will make you cry, right? Okay. Ukraine, on the border of Russia. We hate Russia. Russia's on the border of a superpower. You could be a very rich country. Ukraine could be a very wealthy country. If they did business with Russia, they could be filthy rich, very, very powerful. Instead, we'll ally with a country 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 miles away, and then we'll become an absolute slave to them. We pay all of their bills. Meanwhile, the EU, oh, we're getting cheap energy from Russia. Screw that. We'll buy it at 5 times, 7 times the price from a country 5,000 miles away. Okay, so everybody now is going to say, we are going to align with the U.S., which means now you're at the mercy of the U.S. Now, Israel, their position, very similar. We can do anything we want and no one can do a thing. Well, we won't buy stuff. What do we care? Did you know, and a lot of Americans don't know this, right now, Israel couldn't sell bonds or anything. Their economy is non-existent. However, the United States has said, if you buy bonds or things for the Israeli, government, it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. So if you've got Israel bonds and all this kind of investments in Israel and they fall apart, the United States will pay it off. So what does Israel care? You know what I mean? What do they care? What happens? You don't have an economy. Who cares? The United States will pay it off. Things are getting blown. Who cares? The United States is going to rebuild it. They're going to fix it. They're going to give us money. They're going to do everything. Ha, ha, ha. Nobody can stop us. The only problem is if your support from them ever deteriorates, you got nothing else.
Right.
Zero. You know, it's like, okay, yes, you got them by the short and curlies and they'll support you no matter what. But if for any reason you ever lose that leverage over them and you don't have that power, you are completely destroyed. You have no option, no alternatives. And Ukraine, the EU, but the most of all, Israel are all putting themselves in that position.
Yeah. Well, again, right, to return to the schoolyard analogy, it's kind of like Israel is the little guy that walks around, actually, beating people with a stick or shooting them or whatever, and why can this little guy get away with it? Because there's this 800-pound gorilla behind him, and he just assumes that he's behind. He hardly ever even looks. He just knows he's there. And people are looking up and they see the 800-pound gorilla and say, "Yeah, okay, whatever," or or just you get hit, hit upside the head. But well, I don't know about hitting back because there's that 800-pound gorilla. So, this has been going on for a long time, but there will be some day, where Israel swaggers out there and hits somebody. And the guy's going to look up and say, "Hey, the 800-pound gorilla's gone." And then everybody's going to look out. And, and the thing is, you spent the last half a century making enemies of everybody around you, to the point where they just, the only thing that they desire is for you just to disappear and go away, but they just had to put up with you because of the 800-pound gorilla. But one day he's gone, and then, oh wow, okay,
Yeah, it's. I feel like I've said this. One day Ukraine will wake up, and they'll look and they'll see the predicament they're in, and they ain't gonna be mad at Russia. They're gonna look at Europe and say, "You bastards, you threw us in a cage with this bear and we got mauled by the bear. And you told us you'd help us and make sure the bear didn't maul us. And you just walked away and you didn't do nothing. And now we're screwed and we're like, okay, well, the war's over. We've lost. We've been crushed. We need some money." And you're going to say, "Well, now the war's over. You ain't get nothing from us. You were of value to us as long as you were in a proxy war with Russia. You're not in a proxy war with Russia anymore. Your value is gone." It's like the old thing about the prostitution, right? She's got to collect her money up front because afterwards the guy ain't going to pay. You know what I mean? After the act, the John's not going to pay, right? Well, you know what? After you get finished in Ukraine and the fight's over and you're like, okay, we fought Russia as long as we could. Now we need some money and some financial help. He's going to be like, "You got to be kidding me." Yeah. Ask Russia or somebody, right? And if maybe China will help you, or the US, we got nothing for you.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly a possibility. Let's not forget that, like, up to 2014, polls showed that the majority of Ukrainians did not want to be part of NATO. Wanted to be trading with Russia. Let's not forget that Zelensky, even in 2019, even after the coup, was elected on a peace platform and implementation of the Minsk Accords. This is where what the majority of Ukrainian citizens thought. And now, but they have been coerced and propagandized into believing that their future is with the U.S. and that, they need to tie themselves to the West. And, that's their ticket to prosperity. That's their ticket to a good society, a prosperous society. And look where it's gotten. It's just, it's really very, very sad. But yeah, at one point they're going to remember, hey, wait a second, all these promises, all these chances to just bury the hatchet with Russia and to trade with them and to, and each time, these people from the West came and told us, "Don't worry about it. We got your back." I think, it's something that is really not very far in the past. When we talk about, the Istanbul Agreement that was sabotaged by Boris Johnson in the U.S., roughly 3 years ago. And then, again, the people are going to remember that. You say, okay, maybe we went down this, we really believed in you, we really tried believing in you. And, look where it got us. There could be just, some great reckoning and a time of great recriminations too. Yeah. And it's just, you say, yeah, well, actually, now we understand who our real enemy is.
Let me ask you this, an area of the world that I know you have some familiarity with. If you watch what's happening to Ukraine and you're in South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, there must be some growing trepidation, shall we say, regarding the alliance. And I know you at least have some connections to Taiwan. Does it seem to you? I just saw something the other day that said Taiwan, Trump says he's not going to send another $400 million worth of weapons to Taiwan. I think a lot of Americans don't realize something. One of the reasons that the U.S. is backing away from a lot of stuff because they can't afford it. A lot of Americans don't realize that the U.S. is going broke. The U.S. can't afford it. The U.S. is on the verge of maybe something economically quite ugly, and they're trying to get their act together. What do you think? Do you think on the ground in Taiwan or some of these other places, South Korea, that people are starting to say, this alliance with the U.S. and they want us to be cannon fodder against China like Ukraine? Do you think those kinds of conversations are starting to be had?
Yeah, without a doubt, there are. I think actually the one thing in particular was the imposition of tariffs on South Korea and Japan and Taiwan. Actually, these are all supposed to be very close allies to the United States, but they weren't treated like allies. They weren't treated respectfully at all. We just announced, okay, we're punishing you. This is the way it's going to be, and that, yeah, I don't know much about what's happening in South Korea and in Japan in particular, but I do understand that had a negative reaction, and actually they got together to discuss alternatives really to the current arrangement, which is really based on this special relationship with the United States. Now in Taiwan, yeah, there are obvious parallels to Ukraine, and you can see, Taiwan has a nationalist movement. I think it's very different from the nationalist movement in Ukraine, but it's similar in that it, first it sees, okay, this greater power, this great power, neighboring power, and, in the case of Ukraine, we're talking about Russia. In the case of Taiwan, we're talking about mainland China as the enemy, and that they want to define themselves against, and kind of and in both cases, in fact, the cultural links are very, very deep. The Ukrainians, even the Western Ukrainians, are Slavs like the Russians, and they speak a language that is very, very similar to Russian. In Taiwan, in spite of what the nationalist Taiwanese say, they are Chinese. They're a particular flavor of Chinese. They speak a dialect, you might call it, of Chinese, actually pretty much identical to what's spoken on the other side of the Taiwan Strait there. And they have these historical connections. So they're very, very deep. They were part of the Qing dynasty together for something like 250 years. And you can go on and on. And if you walk around in the streets of Taiwan and go up into the hills, you'll see all these little temples, and they're Chinese temples, and they have holidays. They're Chinese holidays, but still there's this attempt to pretend that no, we're not Chinese. We have nothing to do with them. We're kind of like the anti-China. That's something you get from these Taiwanese nationalists. And it's very similar to what you get from the Ukrainian nationalists. It hasn't become violent in Taiwan. Maybe it will at some point, but it's very, very intense. I've met a lot of these people. For example, I can speak Chinese, but I can't speak Taiwanese. And I'll try to communicate with them, and they'll refuse to speak to me in Chinese, even though I know that they can do it. So that's just one example. So you do have this nationalist movement. And why do you have this nationalist movement? I think you have to point, at least part of the blame goes to the U.S. in both cases. These nationalist movements, existed, prior to the recent U.S. interventions. But our unconditional support for them has greatly strengthened them. It's just like they have, if we did not intervene and we say, hey, this is something for you and, your neighbors to work out. If you're in Ukraine, you got to work something out with the Russians, or the Taiwanese, you got to work this out with, with the rest of China. And, we'll be rooting for you, but this is your problem. This is your neighborhood. It's not ours. If that had been our policy, for decades in both places, I think these nationalist movements would be much weaker, or they would be much more moderate in any case, because they would understand it's like, hey, we do have to learn how to live with our neighbors and achieve some kind of modus vivendi. But when you have, again, the 800-pound gorilla, and he comes and says, I'm supporting you, then you don't have to compromise. Then, you can tell your, other citizens of your country or your region, it's like, hey, listen to me. We can actually, this guy, this big guy behind me, he's supporting us. And then, our policies, he's told us that we can carry them out and that we can actually achieve independence, or he suggested that anyway, somewhere down the road. But we just need to ally closely with him. And so you see the consequences in both places. You get these very unreasonable nationalist movements that are maximalist in their demands, that start to pursue a policy of confrontation rather than compromise. I think you have to, if the U.S. wasn't there, they would fold up, sort of like the Israelis too. Again, it's just like we end up empowering the most extreme elements of these societies, the ones that don't want to compromise, and if we did step back and say, hey, our support is not unconditional, the pressure to moderate their stances, to compromise, to actually engage in negotiations in all these different places, would be there, but they're not there because of the U.S.
And, if you look at the thing we started with the soybeans, I suspect the U.S. at some point is going to try to kiss back up to China. Can we please have the soybean? At some point, they're going to have to do that, especially the fact that they're the GOP and that's their base.
Right.
But I suspect China will be like, we're good. We got you. We're good, man. We're thanks for the offer, but we found someplace else. And these people are not sending weapons to Taiwan. So have a nice day, right? That's what I do. But in the same way that the U.S. is suffering from their confrontation with China, that's nothing in comparison to Taiwan, whose the whole entire economy is connected to China. China doesn't have to invade Taiwan. China could say, something, guys, we're not doing business with you anymore. And immediately the Taiwanese economy would collapse. Immediately, instantly. We're not buying anything from Taiwan. Well, they're right across the street. We're not sending them nothing. They would collapse instantly. So China doesn't have to. They could just collapse Taiwan's economy that quick. They have so many options and say, well, guys, if you want the U.S. so bad and you just hate our guts, then, okay, we're good. Just see how this works out for you. And the Taiwan within, it would fall apart within days, weeks, months. They'd have no choice but to call and beg China. What are you going to ask the U.S. to send them stuff 7,000 miles away that the U.S. doesn't even have? Here's a perfect example. Let me show you this real quick. Taiwan drone that helped Ukraine destroy Russia's S-400 $2.5 billion assets eyed by Taiwan. The drone that has supported Ukraine in the destruction of nearly $2.5 billion in Russian assets, including an S-400 air defense system, right? Well, you know what? I don't know. If I'm Taiwan and somebody's telling me, things can work out for you just like they did for Ukraine, that's not a model that I would welcome.
Yeah. And actually, I wouldn't be buying drones from the U.S. I've heard like the Ukrainians themselves, they get drones from the U.S. and they usually just toss them aside after, trying to use them for a couple of days. He said the Ukrainians, that's one thing that they actually are good at. They're good at other things too, but that's actually one area in which they particularly excel, is in making drones and operating drones. And, I know that people like Daniel Davis, has argued, and I think correctly, like the two premier drone powers in the world, the ones that are Russia and Ukraine, because they are using them. They're engaged in drone warfare. It's a drones arms race, and they're just constantly evolving. Every 2 months, something new is coming out. Now, Yeah, China has a huge capacity, and I'm sure they're watching very carefully and learning a lot of getting a lot of information from the Russians. So they're going to be well prepared, when a war breaks out. But the U.S. has proved it, that it's way behind. It really hasn't woken up to this whole new reality. They're still living in the 20th century in many ways when it comes to warfare. So anyway, this is sort of an aside, I know, tangential to what you're saying, but if the US was offering, drones to me, in Taiwan, I would think twice. Let's just put it that way.
I'll put it like this. However many drones the US can give you, China has 25 million more. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah, right.
like really, the U.S. is going to send you something to that island that China first you'd be vaporized in 5 minutes. Conventionally, China would just say, every base, every military, anything that they have on Taiwan, put 5,000 missiles on every single one of them within the first hour, and then we'll give them a call and ask if they're ready to surrender yet. China could literally do that.
Yeah. No, they have been studying Taiwan, probably like every square meter of Taiwan for decades and decades. And I actually remember translating something. It was a study done by the Chinese military of where all the bases were in Taiwan. I remember doing like 25 years ago. I'm a retired translator now, but it was amazing. They just knew where everything was. And that was 25 years ago. And they probably know, even better, just down to every square meter, what's going on. And they've been drawing up plans. This is the one war that they have been preparing to fight. And they've been very patient. Now they have the manufacturing base. Now they have the technology to equal and surpass the US. Right. I really don't think they want a military conquest. They're going to try to use, economic pressure, like you said, diplomatic pressure, and that's part of the long-term plan. And hopefully they'll succeed, and it's going to be a peaceful reunification. In Taiwan itself, there is a really divergence of views. We're always presented like the nationalists, it's explained to us that the nationalists are the real Taiwanese and we're standing by them. Well, they do represent an important part of the population, but not all of it by the long shot. Just like the nationalists in Ukraine, they were a small and now growing part of the population, but certainly not all of Ukraine. My wife is from Taiwan, and her sisters are still there, and they actually want to be unified with China. They're probably a minority viewpoint, but it's not a very small minority. And they, over time, again, it's like more and more people, the Taiwanese themselves, they go to China and they come back and they say, it's amazing. They're ahead of us. This is, it used to be like, 25 years ago, it's like all these backwards mainlanders, they would make jokes about it. And I remember that, for especially like when the opening occurred, maybe more like 35 years ago, and they first began to go there. I remember one guy, a friend of mine, saying he went there and he came back and he said his neck was sore because he kept on shaking his head. I can't believe this place, it's so pathetic. Now it's the opposite. It's just like, my jaw hurts because I'm constantly gaping in amazement at everything that's happening there. So their attitude towards China has been changing over the years. And, China, I think, really does want to avoid a military conquest and, having to make this a military conflict. But I think, over time, they can win hearts and minds, and, hopefully we can have a peaceful reunification.
Now, here we have someone that says Rump, I guess that means Trump, just traded Taiwan for TikTok, right? And here's what I have to say. I think part of the problem is they've convinced America that we are this imperialist power, right? And you'll hear Americans say, we lost fill in the blank. We lost Nicaragua, as if Nicaragua was ours to own.
Right.
Trump traded Taiwan, and that's we own Taiwan.
Yeah.
And TikTok, and China had to do this or else. When the reality is this, China said, we don't care if TikTok closes, it closes. So in the US, so what? It will be in other countries. And the US government got so much heat that they couldn't shut down TikTok. And now they're trying to make a deal with China to keep TikTok going because the amount of heat they want. But the idea that we own Taiwan, and our government trades Taiwan for Venezuela, for this, for that, and that Americans still, to this some extent, have this belief in this power of the United States, that the president of the United States trades and moves countries, that we have, we just, and when that's not a reality anymore.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, there was a time when, yeah, again, like we were saying at the beginning, there was a time when, yeah, we were the hyperpower and we could talk like that, and actually, and our talk reflected a reality. But we're just, those days are well over. Yeah, we can, in the end, we can make trouble, like we've made trouble in Ukraine. We can provoke Russia. We did, and we helped start a war there, and we could do the same in Taiwan, in the South China Sea. We could use Taiwan to provoke China, and maybe it will end up provoking a war, and that'll be catastrophic. In the end, nothing will be achieved, but there will be a lot of people will suffer. We made trouble, and we can, if that's what we're after, okay, we're still pretty good at that. But there's no benefit for anybody, from from those kind of policies.
Here's something before we go. Largest ever delegation of U.S. lawmakers attend 50 states, one Israel conference in Jerusalem. Welcome what was described. Largest ever bipartisan delegation. Democrats and Republicans are there for meeting with senior officials, tours across the country. We value and cherish your support. And then they goes on to say there's an active effort ongoing to erode the ties between the two countries. These efforts are orchestrated by the same forces that supported Iran, accusing China and Qatar of spearheading. We can break the siege, and we will. Blah blah blah. Okay. What's interesting is when I see 50 states, one Israel, what I read from that is this: one Israel is more important than all the other 50 states. Screw the 50 states.
Yeah.
Israel over here is the one important. And now when their constituents are saying, hey, we're unhappy and we're untrustworthy with Israel, all of these politicians say, well, screw them. We're going to go over to Israel to once again show Israel that they're first, that we don't care what these constituents say. We don't care about anything. Israel, there's 50 states back there. There's only one Israel, and you are the one. Almost like the guy who has a harem on the side. In some countries, a guy could literally have a harem and say, well, look, you're my main wife. I want you to know you're important. Do I have another harem? Sure. But they don't really mean anything to me. They're just my harem. You're the actually what, you know what I mean? That's the way it sounds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's the same old story. That's the way it's been for a long time. It's just that, yeah, now people are noticing. And that's the good news. I mean, that's the silver lining to this horrible dark cloud of the Gaza war, really, the Gaza genocide, is that a lot of people who were asleep, who just didn't notice, who maybe were people that were just vaguely aware. I know that was true of a good friend of mine who he said, yeah, I always knew there was some problem over there, but now, his eyes are completely opened, and that's happening. Eyes are opening all around. These kind of trips, they've been happening again for decades, right? But now, yeah, it attracts attention, and everybody's saying, like, what the heck are you doing over there? Something's wrong. And hopefully we'll see some changes at the ballot box. I hope so. These people, I think, like that go on these Israeli junkets, they're beyond saving. They're probably in the pocket of these big donors that are Zionists and so on, and but maybe, but just maybe there are enough people whose eyes have been opened. The next time, maybe the midterm elections, we're going to see a real shift. I'm hoping. If it doesn't happen, I'm going to be pretty disappointed.
If it doesn't happen, you better look at those machines, because I think they have to end this by the midterms. But here's the thing about it: they got to end this by the midterms. But they can't end it by the midterms, because Israel is now in a forever war. Israel is now nothing more than a proxy war machine. That's all it is. It's not even a country anymore. Israel's job is to be at war. It is a proxy war machine in the Middle East to destabilize the Middle East, to take over completely, to spread out the Middle East. That's its job. Israel, as I see it today, can never really go back to being allegedly just a country. It is now so unstable, and it is now in, which again is the destruction of Israel. How can a country be involved in gigantic wars? What, 10 years from now? What happens if you're an Israeli mother and you have a child? Can you say, well, she's going to grow up, this son right here is going to grow up to be 18, and then at that point he's going to go into the IDF and he'll be fighting into Syria and Lebanon? You know what I mean? I think we're looking at the end of Israel simply because what it is now is not something that a lot of the people who moved there would be attracted to. And, you know, you look, there's all these people moving to Cyprus. It's flooded with Israelis. All these people coming back. Everywhere's flooded with Israelis. What it's supposed to be, what it was alleged to be, it's really been revealed to be something else different. And I don't think Israel can go back based on what it's now to being a regular, not that it ever was, but a regular apartheid country. Now it's a completely, once a country goes completely as fascist as Israel is gone, you don't step down from that.
Yeah, I don't think they can. And, you know, it's interesting. Well, I mean, the scary thing is that so much of the Israeli population is actually supporting this. Again, that's what the poll shows. Like 80% or 82% of Jewish Israelis are in favor of ethnically cleansing Palestine. That's been the consistent results of all kinds of polls. And then over 50% are actually just have made statements to the effect, you know, or agree with a statement to the effect that, yeah, we need to kill them all, or they're subhumans and we have a right to kill them all. You know, there are no, I think one of the statements that was agreed with by a majority of Jewish Israelis was that there are no innocents in Gaza.
Right.
Yeah. And so, and we can see that, you know, that's the scary thing is that, okay, well, that's what Israel has become. It's not just, okay, the problem is not just Netanyahu. It's not just, you know, this current coalition government. The problem is Israel itself. And yes, a certain number of people, like you're saying, you know, a considerable number, you know, hundreds of thousands have left Israel. They don't want to be a part of it. I can understand that entirely, you know, and they're putting distance between themselves and Israel, former Israeli citizens, you know, former Zionists that now have abandoned the Zionist project and putting themselves, you know, the distance between themselves and the Jewish state. That's happened. But within Israel, and even outside of Israel, there actually has been a consolidation. You get a polarization, and the majority is actually even more firmly committed to the Zionist project than they ever were. You know, that's what we're seeing. And so it's like there were the dissenters, there were the moderates, and a few of them still exist, but now they're just a tiny minority, and they're probably looking at each other and saying, you know, we better get out of here. This is just crazy. And so that you end up with a country that is just made up of fanatics. You know, that seems to be where we're headed.
I think that's where we are. Thank you very much, Peter Erickson, everybody. You can find Peter over at Conversations Among the Ruins, one of my favorite channels. Charlie and Pete are on. When are you guys on? When do you put your stuff out?
Yeah, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And of course, I think Charlie chops up some of the stuff and releases it at other times to various parts of the conversation. Right. So it's great. Thanks a lot, everybody. As I always say at the end, you know, whether it's buy me a coffee or Patreon, Cash App, whatever, if you can afford to, I certainly appreciate anything that's donated to the channel. There's a P.O. box there. So if you want to send something snail mail, I just got a book today I got to look into, and all kinds of cards and stuff like that. So certainly appreciate that. There's my snail mail. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.